Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones protected by the people you trust the most. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and for most of my 68 years, I believe my older brother was the one person in this world who would never betray our family. If someone had told me that a single envelope would force me to question everything I thought I knew about him, I would have laughed and called it impossible. Yet that is exactly what happened. The envelope arrived 2 days after my mother's funeral. There was no stamp, no return address, no explanation. I found it resting against the front door when I returned home from buying groceries on a quiet Saturday afternoon. At first, I assumed it was another sympathy card. Since my mother's passing, dozens had arrived from relatives, neighbors, church friends, and people I had not spoken to in years. I almost placed it on the kitchen counter with the rest of the unopened mail. Something stopped me. Perhaps it was the weight of the envelope. Perhaps it was the fact that my name had been written by hand instead of printed on a label. Whatever the reason, I carried it to the dining room table and opened it immediately. Inside was a single folded document. I unfolded the paper and stared at it for several seconds before I fully understood what I was looking at. It was a county property transfer record. My family had owned farmland outside Lexington, Kentucky for generations. Nearly 300 acres of rolling fields, barns, fences, and grazing land that my grandfather purchased many decades earlier. The property was more than an asset. It was part of our family identity. Every holiday gathering, every reunion, every childhood memory seemed connected to that land. That was why the document felt so strange. According to the record in my hands, a significant section of the property had been transferred years earlier. The recipient listed on the document was my brother, Thomas Brooks. I frowned and read the page again. Then a third time. The date showed the transfer had occurred nearly 7 years ago. I had never heard a single word about it. Neither had my daughter Rachel. As far as I knew, the estate remained under my mother's ownership until her death. I immediately reached for my phone and called Thomas. He answered after only 2 rings. His voice sounded calm, friendly, familiar. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Surely there was a simple explanation. I told him about the document. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. Then he laughed softly. He told me not to worry. He said it was old paperwork and that everything had been handled properly years ago. His answer should have satisfied me. Instead, it left me unsettled. My brother had always been patient when explaining family matters. This time he sounded eager to end the conversation. Within 2 minutes the call was over. I sat alone at the table staring at the document. That was when I noticed something I had missed earlier. A small handwritten note appeared near the bottom margin. It was written in blue ink. The handwriting did not look familiar. The message contained only one sentence. Find the rest of the records before he does. A chill moved through me. I looked around the empty room as if someone might suddenly appear and explain everything. Nobody did. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was beginning to disappear behind dark clouds. The house felt unusually quiet. For the first time since my mother's funeral, grief was no longer the strongest emotion in my heart. It had been replaced by something else. Suspicion, questions, unease. I folded the document carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Deep down, I already knew my life was about to become far more complicated. What I did not know was that this mysterious envelope was only the first piece of a truth that had been hidden from our family for years. I barely slept that night. The envelope remained on the dining room table beside my mother's framed photograph, and every time I walked past it, I found myself staring at the handwritten message again. Find the rest of the records before he does. The words seemed impossible to ignore. By sunrise, I had already made up my mind. If there were additional records, I intended to find them. The next morning, I drove toward the family farm outside Lexington. The familiar countryside rolled past my windows as it had hundreds of times throughout my life. Green fields stretched toward the horizon. White fences lined the roads. Old barns stood against the bright Kentucky sky. Normally the drive filled me with comfort. That day it filled me with questions. Thomas was already at the property when I arrived. His pickup truck sat near the main barn, exactly where it always did. My brother had spent years managing nearly every aspect of the estate. After our father passed away, he became the person everyone relied on. He paid taxes, coordinated maintenance, handled legal paperwork, and oversaw property decisions. Nobody questioned his authority because nobody believed there was a reason to, including me. When Thomas spotted me walking toward the farmhouse, He smiled. "You are here early," he said. "I could not stay home," I replied. "Too much paperwork to think about." For a brief moment, his smile seemed to tighten. Then it returned. We spent several minutes discussing routine matters. Weather forecasts, crop leases, repairs needed on one of the equipment sheds. The conversation felt normal on the surface, but something had changed. Every answer he gave seemed carefully measured. Every topic stayed safely away from estate ownership. Finally, I decided to ask directly, "Thomas, why did part of the property transfer into your name 7 years ago?" The question hung between us. My brother looked toward the fields before answering. Mother approved it. Why was nobody told? He shrugged. Because it was administrative. Nothing important. His response did not make sense. Our mother had always believed in transparency. She discussed major decisions openly. She certainly would not have quietly transferred valuable family property without explaining it. Yet I said nothing. Instead, I watched him. For the first time in my life, I felt as if I was speaking to someone I did not fully know. After lunch, Thomas left for an appointment in town. The moment his truck disappeared down the road, I drove directly to the county records office. The property transfer document included a reference number near the bottom. I hoped it would lead somewhere. The records clerk was polite and efficient. After entering the number into the system, she frowned slightly. "There are additional filings connected to this transaction," she said. My pulse quickened. "How many?" She turned her monitor slightly, so I could see. Several entries appeared on the screen. Transfer records, ownership amendments, supporting documents. The list was longer than I expected. Much longer. I requested copies of everything available. Nearly 40 minutes later, I walked out carrying a thick folder. I sat inside my car and began reviewing the pages immediately. The first few documents repeated information I already knew. Then I found something unusual. One filing referenced a parcel number I did not recognize. Another listed acreage totals that differed from estate records I remembered seeing years earlier. Most troubling of all, Thomas's name appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork. By the time I reached the final page, my hands felt cold. I looked back at the stack and noticed a handwritten notation on one of the copies. The note was small and easy to miss. Yet the words instantly caught my attention. Related records archived under supplemental estate review. My heart began pounding. There were more records. Exactly as the anonymous message had warned. And for the first time, I realized the mysterious envelope may not have been a warning about the past. It may have been a warning about what someone desperately did not want me to discover. The drive home felt longer than usual. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me, and every time I glanced at it, I felt the same uneasy sensation growing stronger. The records I had collected were no longer isolated documents. They were beginning to form a pattern. That was what frightened me most. Random paperwork could be explained. Patterns were harder to dismiss. When I arrived home, I spread everything across the dining room table and began organizing the documents by date. The process took hours. Property transfers, ownership adjustments, supplemental filings, supporting records. By early evening, the table was completely covered. As I worked, I noticed something unusual. Several documents referenced the same parcels of land, yet the acreage totals changed from one filing to another. The differences were small enough to escape casual attention, but they were there. I reached for a notepad and began writing down every discrepancy. The list grew longer with each page. Around 7 o'clock, my daughter Rachel stopped by. She had been checking on me frequently since the funeral. The moment she walked into the dining room, she froze. "Mom, what happened here?" she asked. I gave a tired smile. "I think I found something." Rachel sat beside me, and together we spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the records. Unlike me, she approached the documents with fresh eyes. She was not burdened by decades of family assumptions. She simply followed the information wherever it led. Eventually, she pointed toward a transfer record near the bottom of the pile. "This signature looks different." I leaned closer. At first, I did not understand what she meant. Then I saw it. The signature belonged to my mother. At least it appeared to. Yet something felt off. The shape of certain letters seemed inconsistent. The spacing looked unusual. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore once noticed. We compared it to several greeting cards my mother had sent over the years. The differences became more apparent. Neither of us was a handwriting expert, but the inconsistency was troubling. Rachel looked at me carefully. "Have you shown any of this to Uncle Thomas?" I shook my head. Not since our conversation at the farm. She nodded slowly. Good. Her answer surprised me. Why good? She placed the document back onto the table. Because right now you are collecting facts. Once people know you are investigating, facts become harder to find. The comment stayed with me long after she left. That night, after organizing the final stack of papers, I discovered another reference hidden within the supplemental estate review records. This one led to a retired attorney named Harold Whitaker. The name immediately sounded familiar. Harold had handled legal matters for my parents years ago. I had not spoken to him in nearly a decade. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for his contact information and eventually found a phone number. To my surprise, he answered personally. After introducing myself, I explained that I was reviewing old estate records connected to my mother's property. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Then his voice changed. Eleanor, he said carefully, there are some conversations that should have happened years ago. My heart immediately began racing. What do you mean? Another pause followed. When he finally spoke again, his tone was measured and serious. I think it would be better if we discussed this face to face. We arranged to meet the following morning. After ending the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table staring at the phone. The room felt strangely quiet. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the yard. For days I had been following a trail of documents without knowing where it would lead. Now, for the first time, it felt as though someone was waiting at the end of that trail. And deep inside, I could not shake the feeling that whatever Harold Whitaker was about to tell me would change everything I believed about my family. The next morning, I left home before sunrise. The drive to Harold Whitaker's office took a little more than an hour, yet it felt much longer. Questions filled my mind the entire way. Why had he sounded so serious on the phone? What conversations should have happened years ago? Most importantly, what did he know about my mother's estate that nobody else had told me? Harold had retired several years earlier, but he still maintained a small office above a historic building near downtown Lexington. The waiting room was modest and quiet. Family photographs and framed certificates covered the walls. When his assistant showed me into his office, Harold rose slowly from behind his desk and greeted me warmly. Time had added more gray hair and deeper lines to his face, but I immediately recognized him. After a few minutes of polite conversation, his expression became serious. He opened a drawer and removed a thin file folder. My heart immediately began beating faster. Your mother came to see me several times during the last few years of her life, he said. Most of those meetings were private. I frowned. She never mentioned them. Harold nodded. That does not surprise me. He opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. Some were notes from meetings. Others appeared to be correspondence related to estate planning. Then he placed a folded piece of paper on the desk between us. This is what I think you need to see. The paper was a letter written entirely in my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The date showed it had been written nearly 5 years earlier. As I began reading, a strange feeling settled over me. The letter was not dramatic. It contained no accusations. Instead, it expressed concerns. My mother wrote that she had become increasingly uncomfortable with how information regarding the estate was being handled. She mentioned feeling excluded from certain discussions and confused by explanations she received when asking questions. One sentence immediately captured my attention. I love my son, but I no longer understand everything that is happening with our family's property. I read the line 3 times. It did not sound like the mother I remembered. She had always trusted Thomas completely. Harold remained silent while I continued reading. Near the bottom of the letter, another sentence stood out even more. If something happens to me before these matters are resolved, I hope someone eventually follows the records. I lowered the paper slowly. For several seconds, I could not speak. The room felt unusually still. Finally, I looked up at Harold. Why did she write this? He leaned back in his chair. Because she was worried. About Thomas? Another pause followed. About transparency, he answered carefully. Your mother believed families function best when information is shared openly. She began feeling that too many important decisions were being concentrated in one place. His words echoed in my mind. They matched the uneasy feeling that had been growing since the envelope appeared at my door. I asked whether my mother had ever discovered anything specific. Harold shook his head. Not completely. She had questions. She was gathering information. Unfortunately, Her health began declining before she could finish. A painful sadness settled over me. For the first time, I realized my investigation might be continuing something my mother had started years earlier. Before I left, Harold handed me copies of several documents from the file. Most appeared routine. One did not. It referenced an estate review meeting scheduled 4 years earlier. According to the notes, the meeting was never held. The reasons section contained only a brief comment. Requested postponement by estate administrator. The estate administrator had been Thomas. As I drove home later that afternoon, the letter rested safely inside my purse. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but my thoughts remained fixed on my mother's words. She had not left behind accusations. She had left behind warnings. And for the first time since this began, I felt certain of one thing. The mysterious envelope, the property transfers, the supplemental records, and my mother's concerns were all connected. Somewhere within those connections was the truth. The question was how much of that truth had remained hidden for all these years. For the next several days, my mother's letter rarely left my side. I read it every morning and every evening, searching for details I might have missed. Each time I reached the sentence about following the records, I felt as though she was speaking directly to me across the years. Rachel felt the same way. The investigation had become part of our daily routine. After work, she often stopped by my house, and together we reviewed documents spread across the dining room table. One Thursday evening, as we compared county filings with old estate records, Rachel suddenly sat upright. "Mom, look at this." She pointed toward a reference number listed on one of the supplemental filings. At first, it appeared insignificant. Then I noticed it connected to a storage facility located outside Lexington. Neither of us recognized the address. Curious, we began searching through the rest of the paperwork. The same location appeared again. Then again. Each reference was tied to archived estate materials. My pulse quickened. What if some of the missing records are stored there? Rachel asked. The possibility seemed impossible to ignore. The following morning, we drove to the facility. The property sat near an industrial area on the outskirts of town. Rows of storage units stretched across several acres behind a security gate. The manager was friendly but cautious. After reviewing identification and documentation connected to the estate, he eventually located a unit associated with a long-expired administrative account. What happened next surprised both of us. The account records showed the unit had remained active for nearly 7 years. 7 years. The same period connected to many of the unusual transactions we had been investigating. With proper authorization verified, the manager allowed us access. As the metal door rolled upward, a cloud of dust drifted into the air. The unit was not filled with furniture or personal belongings. It contained rows of labeled archive boxes. Dozens of them. Rachel and I exchanged stunned looks. Every box carried handwritten labels referencing estate administration, property reviews, tax records, legal correspondence, and ownership documentation. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt as though we had discovered an entire chapter of family history hidden in plain sight. We spent hours opening boxes and examining contents. Most materials appeared legitimate. Routine reports, maintenance records, accounting statements. Then we found something more significant. One box contained correspondence between various professionals involved with estate matters over several years. Accountants, surveyors, attorneys, financial consultants. As we reviewed the documents, a pattern slowly emerged. Questions had been raised repeatedly regarding ownership structures and asset reporting. Yet many inquiries appeared unresolved. Some were redirected. Others simply ended without explanation. Near the bottom of one file, Rachel found a memorandum that immediately captured our attention. The document summarized concerns raised during an internal review. Several sections were highlighted. One sentence stood out above everything else. Recommendation deferred pending administrator approval. The administrator, referenced throughout the document, was Thomas. My stomach tightened. The pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Every road seemed to lead back to the same person. Yet despite everything we had discovered, I still struggled emotionally with what the evidence suggested. Thomas was my brother. We shared childhood memories, family traditions, holidays, and decades of trust. Accepting that possibility felt almost impossible. Late that afternoon, as we prepared to leave, Rachel opened one final box. Inside sat a collection of old financial summaries arranged chronologically. She lifted the first folder and immediately frowned. "Mom, I think you need to see this." The summaries documented assets associated with the estate over nearly a decade. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then we compared the earliest reports to the most recent ones. Several properties no longer appeared. Certain holdings had vanished from later summaries entirely. There were no obvious explanations attached. No notes. No references. Just silence. As we loaded copies of the documents into the car, I realized our investigation had crossed an important threshold. We were no longer chasing isolated clues. We were uncovering evidence that suggested important pieces of the estate's history had been hidden for years. And somewhere inside those forgotten boxes was the answer my mother had spent her final years searching for. The discovery at the storage facility changed everything. Until then, I had been following clues. Now I was following evidence. Over the next several days, Rachel and I worked methodically through the copies we had collected. Every evening, my dining room transformed into a temporary investigation center. Boxes of documents lined the walls. Property maps covered the table. Notes and timelines stretched across large sheets of paper. The deeper we looked, the more one phrase from my mother's letter echoed in my mind. Follow the records. Not assumptions. Not emotions. The records. One evening, Rachel arrived carrying her laptop and several spreadsheets she had created from the financial summaries. She had spent hours organizing the information into a format that allowed us to compare different years side by side. The results were startling. Assets appeared in earlier reports and disappeared in later ones. Ownership percentages shifted. Certain parcels seemed to move between categories without clear explanation. Most troubling of all, several transactions connected to the missing properties appeared to flow through entities that were unfamiliar to both of us. "Look at this," Rachel said as she turned the screen toward me. A series of transactions stretched across multiple years. Individually, they appeared routine. Together, they formed a pattern. Property transfers were followed by restructuring documents. Restructuring documents were followed by ownership adjustments. Ownership adjustments were followed by administrative changes. Every step seemed small. Every step seemed technical. Yet the final result was always the same. Control gradually moved away from the estate and toward entities connected to Thomas. My stomach tightened as the reality began settling in. The process had not happened all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, piece by piece. The next breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. While reviewing archived correspondence from the storage unit, I discovered a letter from an accounting firm addressed to estate administrators. The letter requested clarification regarding several asset classifications. Attached to it was an internal memo. The memo was brief, but one sentence immediately caught my attention. Additional review recommended due to concentration of decision authority. I read the line repeatedly. The accountants had noticed concerns years earlier, yet nothing appeared to have happened afterward. Rachel searched through the files until she located a response. The answer provided to the accounting firm directed all future questions through Thomas. After that, the correspondence ended. No additional review. No documented resolution. Just silence. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A few days later, another development occurred. My phone rang shortly after dinner. The caller identified himself as Michael Brooks, Thomas's son. We had always maintained a good relationship, but we rarely spoke unexpectedly. His voice sounded hesitant. "Aunt Eleanor, I heard you have been reviewing estate records." I hesitated before answering. "I have." Silence followed. Then he surprised me. "I think we should talk." The following afternoon, we met at a small coffee shop outside town. Michael appeared nervous. He stirred his coffee several times before finally speaking. "There were things that never made sense to me," he admitted. He explained that over the years he occasionally asked questions about certain business arrangements connected to family property. The answers he received were always vague. Sometimes conversations ended abruptly. Other times he was told the details were too complicated. As he spoke, I realized he had been carrying doubts of his own. Then Michael said something that immediately captured my attention. "A few years ago, I accidentally saw documents showing ownership structures that did not match what Dad described to the family." My heart began pounding. "What did you do?" He looked down at the table. "Nothing." At the time, I assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. His answer sounded painfully familiar. For years, all of us had assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Before leaving, Michael agreed to review some of the documents we had collected. As I drove home that evening, I could feel the investigation entering a new phase. For the first time, someone from Thomas's side of the family was beginning to question the same things Rachel and I had uncovered. And deep down, I knew that when doubts begin spreading beyond a single person, hidden truths rarely stay hidden for much longer. The days following my conversation with Michael felt different. For the first time since the mysterious envelope appeared at my door, I no longer felt alone in my concerns. Rachel continued organizing records. Harold remained available when questions arose. And now even Thomas's own son was beginning to see the same troubling patterns. Yet despite all the progress, one question continued haunting me. Why had nobody confronted these issues years ago? One evening, Rachel arrived carrying a large binder. She placed it on the dining room table beside the growing collection of documents. I finished the timeline, she said. Over the previous several weeks, she had been assembling every significant event connected to the estate. Property transfers, administrative changes, ownership adjustments, correspondence, accounting reviews, delayed meetings. As we turned the pages together, a remarkable pattern emerged. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same properties resurfaced. The same decisions led to the same outcome. Most important of all, several major changes occurred shortly before scheduled estate reviews that never actually happened. The timing felt too consistent to ignore. The following afternoon, Michael called again. His voice sounded more serious than before. I found something. Within an hour, we met at his office. He closed the door behind us and placed several copies of documents on his desk. I remembered where I saw those ownership records years ago, he explained. The papers came from archived business files connected to a consulting arrangement Thomas had managed. At first glance, the documents seemed technical and routine. Then I noticed several familiar parcel numbers. My pulse immediately quickened. They matched properties we had already been investigating. More importantly, the ownership structures listed in these records differed from descriptions previously given to family members. Michael shook his head. When I saw these years ago, I assumed there was some legal explanation I did not understand. I studied the pages carefully. And now, he released a slow breath. Now I think questions should have been answered a long time ago. His words carried weight because they came from someone who loved his father deeply. Michael was not searching for conflict. He was searching for clarity. That distinction mattered. Later that week, Rachel completed another review of the financial summaries from the storage facility. She discovered that several assets seemed to disappear from estate reports around the same period referenced in Michael's documents. The connection was impossible to overlook. Every new record seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. Information had not simply been overlooked. It had been controlled. On Saturday morning, I received another unexpected phone call. This time it was Harold Whitaker. He asked if I could meet him later that afternoon. When I arrived at his office, he was waiting with a file I had never seen before. I found this while reviewing old archives, he explained. Inside were meeting notes connected to estate administration discussions from years earlier. One page immediately caught my attention. Several advisors had recommended a comprehensive family review of ownership structures. The purpose was simple: ensure every beneficiary understood how the estate was being managed. I turned to the next page. The review never happened. A handwritten note explained why. Meeting postponed pending administrator approval. The administrator was Thomas. I sat silently for several moments. By now, the evidence had become overwhelming. No single document proved everything. But together they told a story that could no longer be ignored. As I prepared to leave, Harold looked at me carefully. "Eleanor, there comes a point when evidence stops being private research and becomes something that affects an entire family." I knew exactly what he meant. The truth was growing too large to remain hidden inside folders and filing cabinets. That evening, Rachel, Michael, and I gathered at my house. Documents covered nearly every available surface. We reviewed everything one final time. The timeline, the transfers, the letters, the accounting concerns, the canceled reviews. When we finally finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Rachel broke the silence. "The family deserves to know." Michael slowly nodded. I looked at the records spread before us and realized we had reached a turning point. For weeks we had been uncovering hidden pieces of the puzzle. Now the puzzle was nearly complete. And very soon, every member of the Brooks family would be forced to see the picture that had been hidden from them for years. The family meeting took place on a cool Saturday afternoon at the community hall near the church where generations of Brooks family gatherings had been held. Long before the scheduled start time, relatives began arriving from across Kentucky and neighboring states. Some came because they had heard rumors of disagreements surrounding the estate. Others simply believed they were attending a routine family discussion following my mother's passing. As I stood near the entrance greeting relatives, I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. Rachel stood beside me carrying several boxes of documents. Across the room, Michael quietly organized copies of records for everyone attending. The atmosphere felt polite on the surface, but tension lingered beneath every conversation. Shortly after 2 o'clock, Thomas arrived. He greeted family members warmly and took his usual seat near the front of the room. For a moment, he looked exactly like the brother I had trusted my entire life. Yet as I glanced toward the folders stacked beside Rachel, I remembered the months of investigation that had brought us here. Once everyone was seated, the room gradually fell silent. I stood and thanked the family for coming. My voice trembled slightly at first, but steadied as I continued. I explained that what we were about to discuss was not based on rumors, assumptions, or personal opinions. Everything presented would come directly from official records, correspondence, financial documents, and estate files. Then the presentation began. Rachel displayed the timeline we had spent weeks creating. Stretching across multiple boards, it connected years of transactions, administrative changes, property transfers, delayed reviews, and ownership adjustments. Family members leaned forward as the sequence unfolded. The visual impact was impossible to ignore. Events that once seemed isolated suddenly formed a clear pattern. Next came the property records. Copies were distributed throughout the room. Relatives examined transfer dates, parcel numbers, and ownership changes. Several whispered quietly among themselves. Others studied the pages with growing concern. Then Michael stood and explained the documents he had discovered within archived business files. Hearing those details from Thomas's own son seemed to affect the room deeply. No one could dismiss Michael as someone pursuing a personal agenda. His voice remained calm and respectful as he described the inconsistencies he had found. The atmosphere grew heavier with each new document. Then I shared my mother's letter. The room became completely silent as I read portions aloud. Her words carried more weight than anything else we had uncovered. She expressed concern without accusation. She asked questions without assigning blame. Most importantly, she revealed that years before her death, she had already sensed that something was wrong. Several relatives wiped tears from their eyes. Even those who had remained skeptical appeared shaken. Harold Whitaker then reviewed archived notes from canceled estate meetings and postponed reviews. His calm professional explanation connected many of the unanswered questions we had encountered during the investigation. By this point, nobody in the room was speaking. Every person seemed focused on the evidence before them. Finally, Rachel presented the financial summaries recovered from the storage facility. Side-by-side comparisons revealed how certain assets disappeared from estate reports over time. Supporting records showed ownership structures becoming increasingly concentrated. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible to everyone. I looked around the room and saw expressions of disbelief, confusion, sadness, and shock. Years of assumptions were collapsing under the weight of documented facts. Then I turned toward Thomas. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. My brother looked at the records spread across the tables, the timelines displayed on the walls, and the faces of family members waiting for answers. For the first time since this journey began, there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. And as silence settled across the hall, everyone understood that what happened next would determine the future of our family forever. For several long moments after the final document was presented, nobody in the community hall said a word. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. Family members stared at the records spread across the tables before them. Some reviewed copies again, as if hoping the information would somehow change. Others simply sat motionless, struggling to process what they had just learned. I looked toward Thomas. My brother remained seated with his hands folded in front of him. The confidence that had once defined him seemed gone. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Eventually, he stood. Every eye in the room followed him. The silence deepened. For a moment, I wondered whether he would deny everything. Instead, he released a slow breath and looked around the room. "I never believed it would come to this," he said quietly. His voice sounded older than I remembered. He explained that after our father died, he became responsible for managing increasingly complicated estate matters. At first, he believed he was protecting the family. Important decisions needed to be made quickly. Financial issues required attention. Administrative responsibilities continued growing. Over time, however, responsibility slowly became control. Control became secrecy. Secrecy became habit. His explanation did not erase what had happened, but it helped everyone understand how years of questionable decisions had accumulated. No single event created the situation. It developed gradually, one choice at a time. When Thomas finished speaking, the room remained quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody shouted. The evidence had already spoken louder than any emotional reaction. Then Michael stood beside his father. His expression reflected both sadness and honesty. "I love my father," he said. "That will never change. But families deserve transparency. Questions should never be hidden simply because someone believes they know best." Several relatives nodded in agreement. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The conversation that followed lasted hours. Family members asked difficult questions. Old assumptions were challenged. Records were reviewed again. By the end of the evening, one conclusion united nearly everyone present. The estate needed independent oversight moving forward. No single person should control information affecting an entire family. During the weeks that followed, attorneys, accountants, and estate professionals conducted formal reviews. Ownership structures were clarified. Reporting procedures were updated. Long overdue documentation was shared with all beneficiaries. The process was not dramatic. It was careful, methodical, and necessary. Some corrections took time. Others happened quickly. Yet the most important change could not be measured through property records or financial statements. It involved trust. Trust had been damaged over many years, and rebuilding it would require patience. Several months later, the Brooks family gathered once again at the farm. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Children played across the open fields. Relatives shared food beneath large oak trees. Laughter drifted through the warm autumn air. The farm itself looked exactly the same, yet something fundamental had changed. The uncertainty was gone. The secrets were gone. For the first time in years, everyone was working from the same understanding of the truth. Near sunset, I walked alone toward the old fence line overlooking the rolling Kentucky countryside. The sky glowed with shades of gold and orange. In my purse rested the letter my mother had written years earlier. I carried it everywhere now, not because it reminded me of conflict, because it reminded me of courage. My mother never finished the search she began, but she left behind enough clues for someone else to continue. Rachel eventually joined me at the fence. Together we looked across the fields that had been part of our family history for generations. "Do you think Grandma knew this would happen?" she asked softly. I smiled. I think she hoped the truth would eventually find its way into the light. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I thought about the mysterious envelope that appeared at my front door after the funeral. To this day, I never learned who delivered it. Perhaps I never will. But whoever sent it gave our family an opportunity we almost lost forever. The opportunity to face reality before it disappeared beneath years of silence. Looking back, the greatest shock was not how much had changed within the estate. The greatest shock was discovering how easily trust can fade when transparency disappears. Yet I also learned something equally important. Truth may move slowly. It may remain hidden for years. But when people have the courage to follow the evidence and ask difficult questions, the truth eventually finds its way home.